Welcome to Become the Leader, the show that equips you to rise higher, lead stronger, and become the leader you would follow. Hey guys, we have got a great show for you today. I've been a huge fan of Patrick Lencioni before I even realized I was reading Patrick Lencioni. From Full Steam Ahead and a bunch of his early collaborations, all the way into the 5 Dysfunctions of the Team. That's the book that really made him famous and really put him on the map. And I've read all of his other books since then as well. But we're going to get into that. We're going to talk about those dysfunctions and how they impact your team and how to overcome them so that you don't have to remain dysfunctional. So I'm Jody Holland.
I'm Mike Grigsby.
And I'm Meghan Slaughter.
Take us away, Mike.
Jody, it's funny. I think you were the first one that introduced me to Patrick Lencioni. I think it was 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. And I thought, why would anybody write about the dysfunctions of a team? Like, should this be like the 5 great functions of a team? Shouldn't this be like the 5 overcoming functions of a team? But when we talk about the dysfunctions and how he unpacks that, starting with trust, which I think it should be, a staple of everything, I think it really begins to help people understand, understanding the negative side so that you can identify what's good. So many of us, we go into business and we think, we want to succeed, but we don't name what success looks like. And I think Lencioni does a fantastic job of showing us the negative so we really understand and kind of aim towards the positive of that. One of the things is we're talking about this, right? What's big in the window for me right now in the consulting work that I'm doing is what we are seeing across the technology environment as a hyper-convergence, this rapid merging of the IT world, the information technology, with the OT world, the operation technology. And as you asked, and many people would, people don't know what OT is. So the operation technology, typically, I work with in the public sector, so I work with a lot of cities, and typically what you'll see is traffic signals or water signals, the sewage, the wastewater management, the street lights. That is the operational technology side, and that has been growing and evolving for many, many years as a silo to what information technology is. And when we think about information technology, we think of cybersecurity, we think of networking, we think of applications, storage, and things along those lines. Those two domains have never really had to talk to each other. And now, because of the emergence of technology, and the thing I like to always say is virtually every physical asset has a digital heartbeat now. We're now seeing not only the rapid convergence of the two environments, but those teams have to talk to each other. And if there's not a better example of where those dysfunctions come into play and trip each other up, it's when you have to bring two teams that have not only not had to do it from an operations standpoint, but actually intentionally elected to not talk to each other and collaborate. That's where we start to see some things fall apart.
I'm not sure you have to have IT involved for people to not talk to each other.
I agree.
There's a lot of different teams, departments one to another or divisions one to another that go, it doesn't really matter what they're doing. We're going to do what I'm doing. And even within a team, you'll find if you've got strong personalities, which most teams do, or you have people that just are challenging to get along with, then you're going to find that you lose trust. And the way Lencioni defined that trust was that is your willingness to be vulnerable and to own your mistakes in front of others. And that's a big thing. So a lot of times we think, well, do I trust those people to do the job? Well, it's the opposite of that. And the way he describes it in the book is it's not just about do I trust them, it's do I trust that I can be vulnerable in front of them, that they're not going to attack me. And that's a different perspective on that. And that's where I think with our conditioning as Americans here, making a mistake is a fatal flaw. Yeah. And yet it's the most common thing in the world. We all make mistakes. So anyway.
Well, we get trained on that really, really early. Go back to kindergarten or first grade. You get the dreaded F going across your paper and you're like, okay, not going to do that again. And so we are conditioned, like you said, we're conditioned to avoid failure at all costs. But the reality is, how do we learn anything except by failing? And we're just actively working against ourselves. And, you mentioned vulnerability, and I think it's important to kind of walk back the history so we don't get into too much of a shame game, right? We didn't just, we weren't just deciding not to be vulnerable. It was our culture around us supported this. Go back to, the earliest days of the Industrial Revolution, and failure was, I mean, it meant the loss of your job. It meant the loss of, ego. It meant the loss of, receptivity within the community. I mean, it was just challenging. And a lot of times that era was funded, or I should say funded, but really propelled by knowing the answer instead of finding the truth.
Yeah.
And now I think with the advent of the internet and just access to so much data, I think we just really have just more of an open mind to finding truth rather than just knowing the answer and regurgitating it, certainly.
Yeah. Megan, your
Yeah.
thought?
Well, when it comes to trust, obviously everybody looks toward the leader for direction. And so that's why it's so important to model that first and be vulnerable with your team. So this is an exercise we have done with many organizations for brainstorming. And as the leader, we tell you to throw out the most ridiculous ideas so that when you're asking your team to come up with ideas, they're not scared to give you any idea because at the beginning of the brainstorming process, you're just looking for ideas. Later, you go through and you eliminate what doesn't work. But it's the same thing with all of your team interactions. As the leader, you go first in establishing that trust, and you have to put yourself out there so that you can ask the same thing of your team.
That's
And
hard.
it
That's really
is hard, but it helps people feel a lot safer to speak up if you're willing to go first.
And so you think about, like, look at the generational perspective on this. I know, working mostly for boomers and traditionalists before I went into business for myself, really only for boomers and traditionalists,
Right.
so not
Right.
mostly, only. Uh, Working for those two generations, they absolutely expected you to get it right. And yet, most of what they would joke about is that the reason that they knew what they were doing is because they got it wrong so often. And then they started figuring out how to get it right after they got it wrong a bunch. So they already went through that. And I looked at Lencioni's book, and with a background in psychology, obviously I have to look up the other aspects of this. So I was looking at Tuckman, 1965, kind of the original theory on team development or team evolution, with the forming, storming, norming, and performing. And most people, like, if you ever took a management class, you were exposed to Bruce Tuckman and forming, storming, norming, performing. Fast forward 7 years after that, early 1970s, he added in adjourning. But what he did through that is he said, when you come together, you kind of give each other the benefit of the doubt. You learn to trust each other because you go, I don't know, maybe they're great, maybe they're not. I just need to get to know them. So he's describing in forming, you're less judgmental until you get a chance to know the person. Or as Woody Allen said, don't judge me for my background, get to know me, I'll give you other reasons. So you look at some of this stuff and you go, the judging that we do within teams sometimes is using kind of a past experience with somebody similar to that. And you go, oh, well, I knew somebody that was kind of like them. And they were always thinking that they were better. And so then you judge the person. But when you're first coming together as a team, you're supposed to give each other the benefit of the doubt, and you're supposed to do things that build trust. What I teach is that you need time and intentionality. You have to spend consistent time together and be very intentional
Yeah.
about trust. Otherwise, the team doesn't develop. That's why having a monthly leadership development program or a monthly team meeting or weekly staff meetings, all those times that you're getting together, those are the things that break down the barriers and start to build the trust. And the way that, if you haven't read the book, I don't want to spoil it for you, but Catherine is kind of one of the main characters in the book. And she comes in as the new CEO, taking over for a founder, which would be hard as a founder of a business. Take a step down, bring somebody else in above you. But she's doing that. But for the first 6 weeks, all she does is observe. She goes to meetings, she pays attention, she listens to people, but she lets the old CEO continue to run things until she gets a handle on what's actually going on. And to Megan's point about the leader modeling the way, you really do have to model what you want, because people will mimic what you do, not what you tell them to do. And I think it was John Maxwell, that said, a leader knows the way, goes the way, and shows the way. And that puts them in that position to be that leader of trust. Now, what's interesting to me is that in Tuckman's research, as well as in what Lencioni presents, the second stage is the tough one. It's not that hard initially to trust each other, but once you annoy each other, then conflict ensues. So the second dysfunction he talked about is the avoidance of conflict. And I think we avoid conflict for a number of reasons, but primarily, I think it's the assumption that people are going to react negatively. And I'd love to get your take on this, Meghan, on what do you think the reason for conflict avoidance is that leads to us just hoping it goes away?
Well, first, I think people don't want to stir the pot because they don't want to be punished for it. They don't want the team turning on them if you disagree and speak up. Or you don't want the leader being mad at you because you had a conflict with their idea or with another team member or anything like that. And that's really hard to face that fear because I myself have kind of struggled with that. I'm not a big fan of confrontation. I can do it if I have to do it, but I don't like to have conflict with others. I am the peacemaker. I try to mediate between people, and sometimes that means compromising in my own beliefs and values, which is a problem because that is not something that you should be doing. You should be comfortable enough to speak up for what you believe in, share your opinion, and have this sense of safety that your team is going to be receptive of it. The fear stems from you worrying that the team will not receive what you are saying or doing well, and that they're going to turn against you. So that's kind of where it goes back to trust. Yes, exactly. You have to have that sense of trust, and then you know that you can get through the conflict together, because conflict should be constructive, not destructive. Because conflict is good. It helps you work through things and overcome problems that can snowball and become worse for you later on if you don't address them.
So Mike, I'm going to throw you a curveball here.
Yeah.
What are some of the signs where you know conflict is about to happen and you don't think it's going to be good? And this could be professional or personal.
I think there's a. I don't know that there's one answer to this, but
Right.
you can start to feel the tension, obviously, right?
So you anticipate.
Yeah, you start to feel the tension, and this is why I said I don't think there's one answer to this, because everybody kind of portrays or demonstrates that tension differently. Some people become more vocal. They'll talk about it, kind of complaining. Others will be more silent. Mainly, Megan, you were talking about the conflict, and a lot of times we automatically think about the external conflict between two teams or whatever the case is. But there's internal conflict. A lot of times people won't speak up because of the internal conflict of, I don't want to say this because I don't want to own it after this. I just want to go do my job. I want to complain and put it out there, but I just want to go back and do my job. So I won't say anything because I don't want to by happenstance end up owning this thing. But Jody, you talk about what are the signs? As a leader, it's important to develop your emotional intelligence for this specific reason. If you can't divine the tea leaves and kind of understand what's happening among the team, you will miss this, and you'll miss it by a mile, and you will think that you had a great meeting, and what you may have had was actual artificial harmony, right? People nodding in the meeting, and then we're absolutely not going to go do that thing afterward. But they were copacetic, they were congenial, they were agreeing in the meeting, and then you end up, we see this all the time on the technology side. IT says don't go do this, and then OT will be like, nope, we're going to do this shadow IT thing. We're going to go to Best Buy or wherever and order something, right? So you've got to pay attention. You got to develop your emotional intelligence to pick up on that.
Yeah, you do. And I was going to say, think about the concept of group think. And that's what happens a lot of times when you, what was the kind of harmony you said?
Artificial harmony.
Artificial harmony. So group think, Dr. Irving Janis, William H. White in Fortune magazine was the first one. Irving Janis started doing a little more of it. And then George Harvey did even more on the concept of coming up with these signs where you have conflict that you're not resolving. You hit some of those where everybody just kind of nods, and then as soon as they leave the meeting, they're like, oh my gosh, can you believe what an idiot that guy was this time? I didn't think it could get dumber, but man, he proved me wrong. And they'll talk about all the stuff outside the meeting, but they won't talk about it in the meeting.
Nope.
That's a symptom of groupthink. And that's when you've got conflict that's bubbling under the surface, but it hasn't come to the surface. And I think there's two approaches that people can have on conflict. There is, like Meghan said, constructive and destructive. Constructive conflict is when we're dealing with the behaviors and the impact of those behaviors. Destructive is when it is about people. Very few people were actually taught how to deal with conflict. They don't have a framework for conflict. That's why we teach that framework in supervisory classes and management classes and leadership classes, like over and over again, because until people get past conflict, they can't get to profitability. And part of what Lencioni describes in the 5 dysfunctions of a team is that you could have the smartest individual people in the world, but if they have not figured out how to click and commit to where they're going, which a lack of commitment is the third dysfunction, then they're never going to perform at the level that they could. And the way I like that Lencioni describes this is, if you have a lack of trust, you will have bad conflict, not good conflict. You'll avoid dealing with things directly. And if you avoid dealing with things directly, then you will not have commitment. If you do not have commitment, then you're not going to have accountability. If you don't have accountability, you're not getting results. And so it's just boom, 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 all the way up. And everything starts at that base of trust. Yeah. And I will tell you, with almost 27 years as an entrepreneur and over 30 years of doing training and development, that is the main thing that I see that holds teams back, is they don't trust that it's okay to be open and honest within the team. Therefore, they avoid the conflict. Therefore, they're not committed. And so, Meghan, I'm going to throw you a curveball. On the commitment piece of things, what do you think either makes a person get committed to the team and the direction they're going, or makes them go, nah, I'm good? You go either way or both.
I think the biggest thing of getting people committed is making them feel heard in the decision-making process. So keeping them in the loop, not just throwing change on them after you've already made a decision, but allowing them to voice their opinions. Even if you don't take what they say and implement it into that decision, just the conversation makes people trust the leader more and makes them feel like they can buy into that decision. And so being heard and feeling safe enough to talk through something like that, even if you disagree, is going to get you a higher level of commitment from your people. I think it's very frustrating for people to feel like they have no say in anything, and they're the ones who have to do the work. So it's people who have never visited your organization making the decisions, telling you to go out and do things, but they don't know what it takes to actually do that thing. And so just having a voice, being heard, I think that's huge.
And I think that, I mean, back in the 1980s, there was a guy named Dr. Douglas McGregor, and he talked about theory X, theory Y, management motivation theory. And it's been interpreted in several ways, like a continuum from autocratic to laissez-faire, with democratic in the middle. And that's a part of what McGregor said, is that depending on the style that a person responds to, that's the level of voice that they need in the decision-making to be committed to go in that direction. So I think you nailed it. On the laissez-faire side, they need a lot of voice. On the autocratic side, they need to know which way to go. But the vast majority of people live in the democratic middle. And his initial research showed that it was somewhere over 90% would be in that center point. They want to have a voice. They have to be heard. They have to know that their voice was considered, and then they'll commit. But until they know their voice is heard, they're not committed. And I would agree with that. Wouldn't you, Mike, that if you're not heard, you're not in?
Well, I'm also coming from a military background that said if we wanted an opinion, we would have issued it to you in basic training.
Actually, go back to the jump in the water thing. Do you remember that story?
Jump in the, my story from the recruiter. Yeah. I think it was my recruiter told me before I went into the military, he's like, if you get what you feel is an unlawful order from your sergeant, he's like, you immediately, if he tells you, go jump in the lake, and you think that's an unlawful order, he goes, you immediately go tell your commanding officer, but you better be dripping wet when you go tell him.
And so that's on the theory of your autocratic side of things, but you signed up for that. And that's, I think, some of the fundamental differences within that team. you have absolute trust built through the basic training, and that's the foundation. So like if I trust someone explicitly and I am in a combat situation or any kind of an emergency situation, I'm not going to question the order. I'm going to follow the order. And that's why that style works well in like the emergency department in a hospital. Is there somebody comes in, they're having, chest pains, it's clear they're having a heart attack. You're not going to go, hey guys, how would you feel about hooking them up to an EKG machine, maybe starting a nitro drip and filling him with saline so we can stop this heart attack? Would that feel all right? No, they're going to start barking orders and you're going to follow the orders. So you get the commitment because you've spent the time building the trust. And in Atul Gawande's book, The Checklist Manifesto, he's a surgeon, and he talked about how just taking the time before surgery for everybody involved to introduce themselves to each other built trust because it built familiarity, and it made them more comfortable pushing back conflict. Therefore, they were all committed to the right outcomes. Therefore, they would hold themselves and each other accountable. Therefore, the results on surgical procedures went way up.
Malcolm Gladwell in his book Outliers talks about I believe it was Korean Airlines, whatever the airline was, but it was a catastrophic event where the culture in the cockpit was that the pilot had final say over everything and couldn't be questioned. And, in the case, and I'm paraphrasing obviously, but in the case was the first officer saw a big mountain coming up and wasn't able or permitted to make the conversation, make the change or contradict what the pilot had said. And sadly, hundreds of people lost their lives as a result of this. And the ability, we talked about the military. Yes, it sounds funny, and it was a true thing that if we wanted your opinion, we would have given it to you. But I had a chance for 4 years. I was an adjunct lecturer or adjunct instructor at the Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth for the U.S. Army. And I was able to present them with ideas at the same time that they were questioning this kind of autocratic way of kind of running and operating the organization. Now, they didn't get away from because I said so, go do this. But at the same time, they were also realizing that they were losing out on some of the best intelligence from these boots on the ground that were front line. And there needed to be this mutual of exchange and kind of operational leadership. Hey, when it's my op, or hey, when I'm out there, I have the decision to say this is the best or safest or whatever. And again, I'm oversimplifying, the conversation, and certainly the decades long change that the Army had in doing that. But it's a great case in understanding the dysfunctions of the team and how they were this huge machine called the U.S. military, how they have actively been looking, and I guess really even to say they've been interrogating their own methods to determine the best, safest, most effective way of operating, of performing these operations.
And I think that's a good point in there. And get your take on this too, Megan, in just a second. But the military has to look at it in the same way that businesses have to look at it, because being completely hands off isn't any better than being completely autocratic.
Right.
The determining factor is twofold. One is, what's the makeup of your team? And that was McGregor's research, is you have to lead in the way people will follow. And then number two, what is the environment you're leading in? And the reason the military has existed the way that it did, where you do not question your commanding officer, is because if you're in that emergency situation, the conditioning needs to be so strong that you go do what you're supposed to do, not push back on that. I mean, can you imagine in the middle of a wartime, if you have a bunch of, boots on the ground kind of people go, I don't really feel like this is a good idea.
Certainly.
Yeah, that's not going to be okay. So it's the context of the situation plus the followership of the group, and those two things work together. Same thing would be true in a consulting environment. You're going to be much more laissez-faire because you need a lot of really independent thinkers that don't go, hey, boss, what do you think? And you see in businesses the lack of commitment, going back to what Megan said about, do you have a say? You get the lack of commitment because you have a bottleneck at the top. And the funny thing about the bottle is the neck is always at the top. And so you have the CEO or the C-suite or somebody in the upper levels that are like, everything needs to run through me before a decision is made. And yeah, I mean, I've seen 3,000 plus employee organizations I'm working with that the CEO is still making the final decision on marketing content.
Yeah,
And you go,
100%.
you have 5 people that are professional marketers. Why? Why are you doing that? And it goes back full circle. He or she does not trust their people. So the trust is a two-way street, and I think it plays into that.
I'll push back just slightly on that, or I'll add to what you just said. It is not always, it is absolutely a trust issue, but it is not always, or I should say, it's not exclusively a trust from the CEO to, or the top leader to their people. It is often a lack of trust in their own self, that they're not sure that they can deliver, or they're not sure they're making the best decisions, or they're not sure that they gave the instructions the right way. And so some of that buck stops here, or has to go through me kind of deal. It's not always to the team. It's a lack of trust within their own agency, and sadly, that never gets communicated. The leader never goes, you know what, I'm doing this because I actually don't trust myself. That would create a whole other set of problems for the leader, but it's a reality nonetheless.
Yeah.
I think that's a great point, and I think that contributes to the fear or avoidance of conflict as well, because people doubt themselves and their own thoughts, so they don't speak up about them.
Yeah.
So true.
So what about next one on there is the lack of accountability within the team. It's like, if you're not committed, you don't feel a sense of responsibility to go do stuff. If I'm not responsible, I shouldn't be accountable. So what have you seen? Because I know you've worked with several organizations, and you worked for another organization as a leader, Meghan, before you got here. What have you seen from an accountability standpoint of how that plays out if, one, the standards aren't there, and two, if people just don't feel like it's their job?
I think a big thing is that everyone shows up and they're thinking with an individual mindset versus a team mindset. So when you have that team mindset, you trust yourself to make decisions and you trust your team, but you're holding each other accountable. And you're holding yourself accountable, but you're also having conversations when you see other people lacking. Because when you have that team mindset, you want everyone to succeed. And so you're pointing things out and you're helping one another. But if you don't have that, then you start thinking, well, I didn't make that decision, so it's not my fault if it crashes and burns. Or I'm doing my job, they're not doing theirs, but that's not my problem. That is a really dangerous mindset to have, because it's hurting everybody involved, including you. And so part of what you do as a leader to establish that team accountability is set the norms, standards, and deadlines for your team and stick to them. Have that follow-up meeting with them. Explain what your expectation is, ask for updates along the way, and if something doesn't get met, then talk through that thing with your team and figure out why it didn't work, and have them come to the conclusion of what they're going to do in the future, because that's going back to getting their buy-in and their commitment. They have to own it personally and as a team.
And
that's good.
The 3 questions that we've always taught, came up with years and years ago, are: can you walk me through what happened? At what point could you have done it differently? What will you do next time? When you think about those 3 points, going back to what you were saying, Meghan, about getting them to own it, the "can you walk me through what happened" is very different than "why'd you do that?"
Yeah, because then they get defensive.
Right, because then it makes it about them instead of about behaviors and outcomes, going back to the conflict piece of this, which creates a commitment. When they say, "in the future I will," that's their commitment, which ties in together as well, and then moves them back up into that true accountability. And the thing I think sometimes we forget about in business is we work so hard to build great leaderships and great cultures. We also sometimes forget it's still about getting the results. Like, no matter how you look at it, how you slice it, or whatever you want to say, businesses have to solve problems, they have to get outcomes, and they have to serve their customer, and that results in profit. And if you don't make enough profit, eventually you don't get to be in business anymore. And Yeah, I don't know if you remember, there was a company, I'm not going to say the name of it, but there was a company in Abilene that printed T-shirts when I worked for the Boy Scouts back then. And they had a sign in their office that says, "We are a not-for-profit organization. We never meant to be. It just worked out that way." And it wasn't long after that, like a year later, they were just out of business.
Yeah.
At some point, you have to turn a profit or you don't get to stay in business. And if, as owners, if you're going without pay for long enough, some point you're going to go, man, I could get a job and I make a lot more money and be less stressed out. And so they go back to work for somebody else. So I think the results are critical too. And that goes back to circle back to what you said about expectations, Meg. If you have the expectations clarified, that should create the commitment because they participated in that gets the accountability. And then that result is what shows up naturally after that.
Yeah, and
Oh, go ahead, Megan.
I was just going to say, I think you have to define success explicitly. So, whatever results you're looking for, talk to your team about what that is, and then keep track of it. Measure things along the way, and then whether you get the results you wanted or you didn't get the results that you wanted, talk about it with your team.
Yes.
And when you're talking about accountability, so my very good friend Robert Kuehl, who is getting ready to release a book called Built Bulletproof. It's coming out later this year, but I can't wait for it to get out so I can talk about it more. But he talks about awareness plus action for this notion of accountability. The awareness side is, did you know or should you have known? And the action side is, what did you do about it? Right? That gets distilled down. That can't, your risk management program can't get distilled down any further than that, right? It's awareness plus action. Jody, you and I had a conversation years ago, and we were just kind of bantering, going back and forth. But the idea popped up in our head around this shared goal, like being reminded that everybody is in the same boat together, right? It was the picture of two people in a canoe cannot paddle different directions. It can't work, right? And as simplistic as that is, picture having 12 people, meaning 12 different departments in the same boat, and each one of them thinking if they do their part, they're going to survive while the rest of it sinks, right? That is a crazy notion, yet that's how we work and operate every single day, as if one thing can't affect the other or one thing doesn't have an effect upon the other. And it's ludicrous to think, but we're doing this to our organizations. We're doing this to our teams every single day. I don't have to worry about that. That's not me. I love, I think George Carlin once was talking about it. He's like, I don't get this red light thing. He's like, I tried it once. He said, sure, there were accidents, but that was back there. That had nothing to do with me, right? So we don't realize what happens in our wake when we disregard the fact that we are really one team. We are really all in this together, and what affects one affects the other.
Yeah, I love the boat analogy. And I think that's why it's so important to create a reward system based on team goals. So when the entire team reaches a certain goal, that's when you give them certain benefits, whether it's an extra day off or it's, dinner with the team, everyone going out and bonding or going to a basketball game, whatever it may be. Having something set up as a reward for the team based on team results is so helpful in that.
It's kind of like an internal result for getting an external result.
Yes.
And everything work together. What's interesting to me, you look at this book. This book was published April 11th, 2002. That's when it came out. So we've been out for almost 24 full years. And I'm shocked. As good of a book as it is, there's still so many people in business that have not heard of the 5 dysfunctions of a team. And they just like, who's Lencioni? How do you spell that? So they don't know about this guy, but this guy has dropped some serious truth bombs about how to build your team effectively. And I've used a lot of his materials over the years, developed a lot of my own materials, but I got to give this guy props that he really organized it well, told it in a parable format in the front half of the book so that you would be engaged in a story and apply it to your own life. Then on the back side of the book, gave you a how-to guide on how to apply it. And I look at these things and I go, I'm a very practical leadership developer. I want to develop leadership because it gets results, not just because it creates a safe space or people feel warm and fuzzy. I've never met a company that's like, we'd like to hire you so we would feel warm and fuzzy. You know, not to be mean, but that's what you hire motivational speakers for, is to feel warm and fuzzy for about a week. And then you go back to reality. You want something practical and implementable, if that's a word, in order to make things work. So real quick, run back through it, and then I'm going to get y'all's final thoughts on this. You build trust. You learn to deal with conflict, basing it on behaviors and impact, not based on people. You then create commitment by getting people's opinions, getting their buy-in, getting them engaged. Because you have their commitment and we trust one another, then moving into accountability becomes much easier. So once we have the accountability factor accounted for and people are owning responsibility for their past choices and their future decisions, then that moves us into getting the outcomes or the results that we're supposed to get. All of that is predicated on clear and open communication up front and the assumption that these people that I am working with are out to help me, not out to get me. And I have told hundreds of leadership teams, if you will just focus on believing that the people around you want the best for you and they're trying to help you, instead of assuming that everybody's out to get you, you will have a drastically different experience of your world. So Megan, you first. Any final thoughts you want to add into this on how to build these great teams?
I have two main thoughts. The first is, as a leader, you set the example. So model what you want from your team and then get each of them to buy into it, whether that's verbally committing to it or actually having them sign an agreement that they will commit to the team objectives. That is something really great to do. The second is, if you have not read The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team,
Glad you got it there.
yes, go read it with your team. And something that we have done that has been really successful with our own team is when we are all reading a book, we take turns teaching a lesson from the book. So have somebody from your team teach about one chapter. Even if they don't want to read the physical copy, they can go listen to it on Audible or whatever, but consume the knowledge from this book in some way or another and teach it to somebody else. Because if you can teach it, you actually are learning it and you know it yourself.
Mike, you're up.
Yeah, I would just have to say, just one closing thought is just vulnerability. It requires this type of leadership requires vulnerability and real, I'll call it authentic vulnerability. It's the kind that says, I'm okay still, even if I don't have the answer. If I know and I'm inquisitive and trying to learn and trying to find the answer, that still puts me and keeps me in a chair. I say it all the time. It's like, as a leader, you got to be solid about where you are in the role that you're in before you'll ever allow your team to kind of push back on that. And your team wants to push back on it. They want to test your resolve. Do you really know? Are you really going to allow them to kind of bring those quote unquote brutal facts to the table and deal with them?
Yep. Excellent. Well, thank you guys for being on here. I have had a blast with you. We love going through books. We all three of us read all the time. So we've always got another book that we can go through, but from the bottom of my heart, thank you for being a listener on this. Please share this with other people. Make sure that you get the word out there on how people can become the leader that they will follow. Thanks for joining Become the Leader. Keep growing forward and become the leader you would follow.